I'm Brian Ross. I'm with the Great Plains Institute. We're a nonprofit organization based out of Minneapolis, been around 20 years. We do a lot of work on decarbonizing our economy. That's our primary mission and focus. And I was going to kind of just talk to you about solar, large-scale solar and agriculture, and some of the issues around that. And I will be as quick as I can here to keep this recording within as close as I can to within the time limits. I just want to kind of start with the history of where we're at, and some of this stuff has already been gone over, but I just wanted to say back in 2007, Minnesota, the solar energy advocates in the state celebrated a big milestone. We had finally, after all of history, finally reached a total of 1 megawatt of solar in the state, enough to power about 150 homes. I know that there was a big celebration because I was part of it. Me and all the other solar advocates in the state, I bought donuts for everyone. Flash forward to 2017, we had another milestone. Solar advocates celebrated a development. There was a few more people in the room at this point. We had installed 1 megawatt of solar capacity on average every 18 hours for the previous year. So that's kind of the kind of transformation that we saw over that 10-year period in terms of the solar energy market in Minnesota. 2017 has been our best year for overall solar installations, but we're actually gearing up for some years similar to that. One of the things that we want to talk about with large-scale solar is that every community in Minnesota, every single one of them, has an economically viable solar reserve for development. And we use that term reserve because we want people to think about solar energy in the same way they would as if they had oil and gas. Everybody knows what an oil and gas reserve is. Well, solar reserves are the same thing. They have economic value. They are geographically located. They're exploitable. It's something you need to plan for as the solar resource becomes increasingly economic. It is a developable resource that people will want to develop because it's an economic thing that they own. And you can see here that across the state, we have substantial amounts of, this is specifically for large-scale solar kind of technical potential that was calculated by the National Renewable Energy Lab by county. So you can kind of see at the local level where you're at. And this kind of excludes things like, it excludes most of the kind of land covers that would be difficult, like forest land. It excludes protected lands. It excludes urban areas. It excludes things on the north sides of hills. Et cetera. So it is something that is not just a simple insulation graph, but rather a land use and solar potential analysis. The current number of projects, and we've already kind of been over this, right now in Minnesota, there's about 18 big large-scale solar projects ranging in size from 75 megawatts to 450 megawatts that have been proposed. That's a total proposed capacity of about 2,800 megawatts in the state right now. That's either in the queue or for a few projects that don't have to go through the queue, like the big 451 that's going at Becker, have been counted in addition to that. Compare that to the total existing capacity that we have in the state right now, which is about 1,600 megawatts. So basically an increase of about 150%, actually 170%, just in terms of proposed projects in the queue today. Now, a lot of those projects won't get built, but it's a measure of the economic demand, of the market demand and the development pressure that we're seeing in and for solar energy. And this is something that communities need to consider as they look at their solar resource. We kind of did a quick calculation, actually it wasn't quick, of the proportion of land that this is going to need. Both the existing solar and the proposed solar. We did it for every single county in the nation, but we kind of zoomed in on Minnesota here for you, where you can kind of see almost every county, again, in the state has some kind of proposed or existing solar, and so some kind of land use already in it. But if you look at the percentages, you can see that actually, even with this monumental amount of solar that's been proposed, if you add it to the existing, we're still only talking about land consumption at the county scale of probably less than 2%, and most of these are actually less than 1%. It is not at the county scale. It's not going to be a big consumption of land, but it is something that is kind of startling to people, and it does come into conflict with a few of our resources, regardless of how much land it's actually been using. Kind of put that into context. Here is kind of the prime farmland that we see across the state. Prime farmland has been defined by NRCS and USDA. We have about 225.5 million acres of land that is in farms in Minnesota. That really hasn't changed over the last 4 or 5 years at all. Our total prime farmland, not just land in farms, but also land that's actually prime farmland, is about 16.7 million acres. And to put this into kind of a development context in that perspective, between 1982 and 2012, we have some pretty good numbers on how much farmland was actually converted to other things, to development. So basically farmland that was developed. And we saw on average over that period about 16,000 acres of land per year that was converted from farmland into something else, some form of development, commercial housing, whatever. Now, the total amount of land for the existing solar that has been built in all of history, the kind of 1,600 megawatts, is about 15,000 acres. So we actually have again, kind of the scale of solar development relative to other forms of development is not really substantial. Now, the solar development will be ramping up, and it is, of course, in addition to other forms of development. So there is pressure on farmland and concerns, but it's not a solar problem. It is a kind of an issue for counties to look at all told regarding development. So I kind of wanted to run over now some of the kind of land use considerations that you might have for principal use solar, kind of big scale solar development. The kind of things we do when we look at land use is we kind of say, where are there going to be conflicts between different forms of development or between different land use priorities that we have in our county? When we have, for instance, agricultural protection priorities that include several different things. Sometimes we want to protect farm soils. Sometimes we want to protect actually farmland, which is a combination of soils and other kind of considerations. That map that I showed you earlier is actually farmland, prime farmland. There is also the kind of viability of agricultural practices, which may or may not happen on prime farmland. It may be on poor soils, but if it's being grazed and it's a viable agricultural production, it still has some value sometimes at the local level in terms of protecting economic base and give it some priorities to this particular land use. And then there's a final category that comes into play, and this is something that happens more around urban areas, where you have rural view sheds and character issues, where people like to look out over farming areas, and when you change it to something else, they get upset. And that is, all of these different things are different elements of the way that farmland preservation, or I should say agricultural protection, works. And when we look at the conflicts between renewable energy development and farmland, we need to understand, what is it that we're trying to protect? Are we trying to protect the natural resource of the soil, or are we trying to protect a view shed? Those are two very different things, and solar will impact those in very different ways. We also have similar considerations around things like natural resources as it relates to land use. We want to protect ecological function and water quality, habitat areas, or recreation areas. These are also things that we need to take into consideration from a land use standpoint when we're talking about siting, 100 to 2,000 acres of solar in our communities. And then finally, we have that community character issue about kind of what we're really doing. What kind of existing uses are we protecting? What kind of mix of uses do we want to see in our community, and the consistency of the landscape, the view shed that I talked about earlier. These are all things that are part and parcel of land use planning and of zoning and regulation at the local level. And these things all come into play, sometimes in synergy and sometimes in conflict with solar development. So one thing that we do advocate for is that people who are hosting the new energy system, which is the large-scale solar is part of the new energy future, right, of what we're going to have. Almost every community, as I kind of noted earlier, has an economic solar resource. Almost every community will be a host community. Host communities should benefit from energy development. And what are the ways in which host communities can, if you plan for it, benefit from energy development? You're going to get economic development in terms of local jobs and spending, a lot of the construction jobs, but there's also some maintenance kind of jobs that come with this. you're going to get increased local property tax income and other forms of income from taxes, as Fritz had just outlined. You're going to get clean power generation, obviously, some of which is going to come to your community at the large scale. A portion of it will be put onto the grid, but it is local power generation. You're going to reduce environmental risk associated with power generation and other kinds of things, including, as we see in Minnesota, there's somewhat controversies around these pipeline things, right? And some of the kind of work that happens around large-scale solar actually can take some of the risk away from that as our energy economy evolves. But one of the most important things is the kind of low-impact development scheme that we can use, which is providing things like water quality protection, habitat value, and agricultural protection if we do it right at the local level. So we can actually not only mitigate for some of the kind of impacts that we might see from large-scale solar, we can actually enhance the ability of communities to benefit for those things. We have written a series of best practices for large-scale solar in terms of zoning and land use. These are things that we work with counties in the SolSmart program. Morris is a SolSmart, is it gold or silver? I can't remember. But Silver, okay. And counties are also been certified across Minnesota in this program. It provides free technical assistance where we can actually walk you through these land use components and help you identify what makes most sense in your community for enabling that solar development that is part and parcel of the new energy system, and something that is a local resource that's there for economic development, but also making sure that it fits the land use priorities and the kind of community priorities that you have at your local scale. We have two components of that. One is what we call siting elements. Where does it go? Where is it most appropriate? And that kind of depends on whether you're talking about what we call community scale or large scale. Community scale is kind of what Fritz mentioned about the community solar garden, but anything less than 10 megawatts, which is kind of a 10 or 100 acres and smaller, is what we would call community scale, because it can usually happen by working with a single landowner on a single kind of set of parcels of land. And it can be integrated into, for instance, an agricultural operation as an income diversification strategy. Large-scale solar is something that's going to be generally much bigger than that. Some people would define it as, we've seen ranges, you can see here on the chart, at 20 acres is the threshold. Some communities have gone up to 100 acres. But large scale is where you can actually see hundreds or even thousands of acres. It's usually going to be multiple landowners. It's going to have a bigger impact. It's a little bit harder to integrate into the landscape. In fact, I would say you really can't do it, but there are still some benefits you can get at the local level for that. And then, so that's the kind of where does it go? Where do you want it? Is one question for those two different kinds of solar. The second is, once you identify where it goes, what kind of site design do you want to see? Things like setbacks and screening, what kind of ground cover, how do you deal with kind of infrastructure associated with communications and power lines and fencing, et cetera. We have in our model ordinance that we wrote for the state of Minnesota and a number of kind of guidance documents about how you do this, what is appropriate, what are the best practices that are reasonable, that protect the community, but also allow for solar development to happen. And kind of how some of that text in the blue box there, language in our model ordinance that kind of explains how you balance things like setback requirements with screening requirements, because they're interactive. So screening is another one of those things that we do see for large-scale solar, and it's important to kind of here's some principles of screening. Make sure your screening requirements are consistent with what you're already using in benchmarking, considering the screening circumstances, such as are you requiring screening of a solar farm from other land that's nothing but in corn and soybeans? That doesn't make any sense. The bigger the setback requirement, the less screening you need, and the more screening you have, the smaller the setback requirement needs to be. And you really need to avoid arbitrary standards. You need to avoid saying, for everything else, we're going to require a moderate screening. For solar, we're going to have to build a big 10-foot berm, put trees on top of it so that nobody from any angle can ever see it. That's an arbitrary standard because it applies only to one particular land use, which is solar. So that is something to avoid. And we have some language here in our model ordinance that kind of helps direct you to that. And again, we can work with you as needed. One of the most important things, though, is the kind of the ground cover. because this affects things like visual impacts. It affects surface and groundwater, water quality, soil health, the long-term viability of that prime farmland, whether if it comes out of solar production, habitat, and things like carbon sequestration that you can actually enhance if you do the right ground cover types on the solar farm. So we also have guidance on that. We have site design for co-benefits kind of standards, and the ground cover and buffer area standards here, which I'm not going to go through in any detail, but really which are dependent on Minnesota's habitat-friendly solar standards, which are administered by the Board of Water and Soil Resources. And we have language that specifically allows local governments to tie their programs and their ground cover requirements to the state. So you don't have to become an expert in what's a pollinator standard. You can just use the state standard. And this is a really good thing that should be considered in order to make sure that the community is getting the benefit and mitigating for some of the impacts of the large-scale solar. And we have guidance in there again in that blue box that kind of explains that in addition to ordinance language. Similarly, we have some standards around agricultural protection. What can the community do in order to mitigate impacts consistent with their existing agricultural protection standards? One of the most important things we want to say about agricultural protection is it don't make it arbitrary. If your county already has agricultural protection standards and goals in your comprehensive plan or in your zoning, then it's reasonable to apply those to solar development. Just do so in a way that makes some sense. And we gave you some examples over on the left there, some specific things like incorporating agriculture into the site in agrivoltaics, making sure if you're going to take farmland out of production, make sure that it's in a wellhead recharge area or something like that, where you probably want it out of production anyway. But what you don't want to do is apply an agricultural protection standard to solar that doesn't apply elsewhere. There was a recent case in Minnesota, not very short time ago, where the county's objection to this large-scale solar was struck down because they claimed it was about agricultural protection, but the court noted they didn't apply agricultural protection to anything else. So housing could go in, commercial development could go in, but, and that was all fine, no agricultural protection there, but solar, all of a sudden we're concerned about agricultural protection. The court didn't buy it. It said that's arbitrary and capricious and that's against the law. So you can do agricultural protection and have it apply to solar, but it has to be more than just applying to solar. So I think that that's a good standard. I used to do ag protection as part of my land protection work. So it's something that I think is important for counties, but make sure that you do it right or you may be in trouble. So anyway, that's my rapid run through of my slides. And hopefully we didn't go too far over, and I guess I won't take questions because we're probably already over. But thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Brian. There's one quick question I think you can probably answer fairly quickly. It's about the end of life considerations for disposal of solar. I know there's a stakeholder proceeding going on right now. The PCA is overseeing, and we're down to like 4 options, I think. Is there any update on which way they're leaning, or is it still stakeholder debate?
Yeah, well, and the proceeding that's going on with that particular, with the end of life stuff, it kind of has 2 elements that local communities are concerned about either one or the other. One is the decommissioning standard, and that's kind of saying what happens at the end of life of the solar farm, of all of the arrays, and how do you actually decommission it? When do you decommission it? Do you allow it to be repowered? All those kinds of things. And then there's the more discrete issue about what you do with solar panels. And whether or not they're recycled. And that is a component of decommissioning, but sometimes communities are focused more on the recycling issue and less on the decommissioning. I actually happen to think that decommissioning is something that, because it gets very complicated, it's 25 years in the future. None of us have a crystal ball. It would be better if the state took responsibility for some of that decommissioning work, because they're in the best position to know what's viable and what's not viable. And local governments shouldn't have to kind of figure out what the bonding requirement is for a decommissioning bond for something that's going to happen in 25 years that nobody's done yet, right? I mean, there's been so few solar farms that have been decommissioned, we really don't know. The industry says it's going to pay for itself because we're going to get so much great scrap out of there and that it's going to be a recycling market. and we're going to pay for it. I don't think anybody quite buys that anymore, but it is a viable point. To what extent is there a cost? The one thing we don't really need to worry about on decommissioning is that the land itself, if you do it right, if you do solar development right in your community and you require things like habitat-friendly ground covers, the land is going to be in better shape at the end of your 25 years than it was at the start. You're going to have built soil health. You're going to have better groundwater conditions. All those things are things that are in place. And the decommissioning process for solar, in terms of getting the equipment out of the ground, is probably less impactful than any other kind of decommissioning. If you had a big box store, it would be a big deal to decommission it. If you have a solar farm, it's actually relatively straightforward. I don't mean to say that it's not completely straightforward. There's always going to be complications. And when you get on a site with big equipment, it's going to have soil compaction and things are going to happen. But it is something that can be done actually fairly quickly on a decommissioning. And the end result of the land is that you actually have either a viable land for other forms of development, or you have land that can be turned back into agriculture, and it'll actually be in better condition than it was when it started. So those are kind of the decommissioning angles that communities should be considering when they think about this decommissioning work. And they should be attending very carefully to the proceedings at the state, because things like what you do with solar panels at the end of their life in terms of kind of keeping them out of the landfill, it's an important question, as it is for every kind of built environment. What do we do with buildings when they're at the end of their life? Do we have recycling requirements at the local level for that? Not very often. But all forms of development actually should have an end-of-life consideration, and solar is not exempted from it.